The sun shone brightly over Greenfield Park, a quiet neighborhood playground where children laughed and played. Swings creaked, a slide gleamed under the afternoon sun, and the sound of sneakers scraping against wood chips filled the air. It was an ordinary day, until it wasn't. Margaret Whitmore sat on a park bench, watching over her grandson, Ethan, as he built a small sand castle. She was a woman in her late 50s, her short blonde hair neatly styled, her pearl earrings gleaming. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 2 decades and took pride in its family-friendly atmosphere. But today, something made her uncomfortable. A little black girl, no older than 8, was playing near the jungle gym. She had deep brown skin and wore a pink t-shirt with a unicorn on it, her curly hair tied up in 2 playful puffs. She wasn't causing any trouble, just running around, pretending to be an astronaut, jumping from platform to platform as if she were landing on distant planets. Margaret frowned. She hadn't seen this child before. The other children playing were kids she recognized, their parents' familiar faces from PTA meetings and neighborhood barbecues. But this girl, where were her parents? Why was she here alone? Margaret glanced around. No one else seemed to be paying attention. The girl was yelling excitedly to herself, lost in her imaginary space adventure. Margaret hesitated, but a feeling of unease settled over her. What if she wasn't from this neighborhood? What if she was lost? Or worse, what if she was up to something? With a sigh, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? Yes, hello. I'm at Greenfield Park, and there's a young girl here, unsupervised. She's playing alone, and I don't know if she belongs in the neighborhood. Could you send someone to check? Is the child in any danger? No, but I just think someone should look into it. The dispatcher took down the details and assured Margaret that an officer would be dispatched. Satisfied, Margaret put her phone away, folding her arms as she waited. About 10 minutes later, a police SUV pulled up to the park. A uniformed officer stepped out, a tall, black woman with a confident stride. Her badge gleamed in the sunlight as she scanned the playground. Margaret stood up, relieved. Officer, I'm the one who called. The officer turned to her, eyebrows raised. And what seems to be the issue? Margaret gestured toward the jungle gym. That little girl over there. She's been playing alone for a while. I wasn't sure if she was supposed to be here. The officer followed Margaret's gaze, and then, to Margaret's shock, she broke into a wide smile. Kaya, the officer called out. The little girl turned around, her face lighting up. Mommy! She ran across the playground, arms outstretched, and the officer crouched down, wrapping her in a hug. Margaret's mouth went dry. This is your daughter? She asked, voice suddenly small. Yes, the officer said, standing up, one hand resting protectively on Kaya's back. Is there a reason you thought she didn't belong here? Margaret's face flushed. I didn't mean anything by it. I just wasn't sure if she had a guardian around. I was concerned for her safety. The officer's smile faded slightly, and her gaze grew sharp. Were you concerned for her safety, or did you assume she didn't belong because she looks different from the other kids? Margaret stammered. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. She thought about how quick she had been to pick up the phone. Would she have done the same if the child had been blonde-haired and blue-eyed like her grandson? The officer sighed, her expression softening just a bit. I understand wanting to look out for the community. But maybe next time, ask before assuming. My daughter has just as much right to be here as any other child. Margaret swallowed, nodding. I see that now. I'm sorry. The officer gave her a small nod, then turned back to Kaya. "Ready to go home, sweetheart?" Kaya took her mother's hand, flashing Margaret a bright, innocent smile. "Bye, lady," she chirped before skipping toward the car. Margaret sat back down, feeling strangely drained. She watched as the officer buckled her daughter into the car, then drove off, the sound of laughter floating through the air. She had always thought of herself as a good person. But today had forced her to ask herself a difficult question: was she really as fair and open-minded as she believed? As Ethan ran up to her, excitedly tugging on her sleeve about his sandcastle, she made a silent vow to do better. That night, Margaret lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. The encounter at the park played over and over in her mind, the police officer's firm but measured words, the little girl's bright smile, the sting of realizing she had made an unfair assumption. Had she really done something wrong? She hadn't meant any harm. She was just looking out for the community, wasn't she? But deep down, she knew the truth. If Kaya had been a little white girl, she wouldn't have called the police. Margaret sighed and turned onto her side, glancing at the framed photo on her nightstand, her late husband, James, holding baby Ethan. James had always been the one to challenge her, to make her see the world in ways she never had before. He had grown up in a diverse neighborhood and often reminded her how different people's experiences could be. "People don't always get the same benefit of the doubt, Maggie," he had once told her. And today, she had proven that. The next morning, Margaret decided she couldn't let the conversation end at the park. She needed to do something more. She started with a simple search on her phone: how to recognize and overcome racial bias. She read article after article, learning about unconscious bias, microaggressions, and the history behind why Black children were often seen as older or more suspicious than their white peers. It was uncomfortable, but necessary. Then, she did something she had never done before: she looked up local community events outside her usual circles. That's when she saw it. Greenfield Unity Picnic, a celebration of diversity and community. The event was happening that Saturday at the very park where everything had unfolded. There would be food, music, games, and guest speakers on community inclusion. Margaret hesitated for a moment but then sent a quick text to her daughter, Lisa. "Margaret, do you think Ethan would like to go to the Unity picnic this weekend?" A minute later, her phone buzzed. "Lisa, that sounds like a great idea. He'd love it." That Saturday, Margaret arrived at the park with Ethan, feeling slightly out of place. There were families of all backgrounds gathered: Black, white, Latino, Asian. Music played from speakers, kids ran around with face paint, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. And then she saw her. Officer Daniels. She stood near a picnic table, chatting with a group of parents while Kaya sat on a blanket, happily eating a cupcake. Margaret took a deep breath and walked over. Officer Daniels turned when she approached, her expression neutral. "Hello, Mrs. Whitmore," she said. Margaret cleared her throat. I wanted to say again that I'm sorry. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realize now that I judged Kaya unfairly. It wasn't right." The officer studied her for a moment before nodding. "I appreciate that." Margaret hesitated. Would it be all right if Ethan played with Kaya for a bit? Officer Daniels smiled, finally softening. "Of course. I think she'd like that." Margaret turned to Ethan. "Sweetheart, do you want to go play?" Ethan, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, nodded eagerly and ran over to Kaya, who giggled and handed him a toy. Margaret watched them for a moment before turning back to Officer Daniels. "If there's ever anything I can do to help, anything to make our neighborhood more welcoming, please let me know." The officer nodded. "You're already doing it, Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret exhaled, feeling something lift from her chest. She wasn't perfect, but she was willing to learn. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start making things right. As Margaret stood by the picnic table, watching Ethan and Kaya chase each other around the grass, she felt something she hadn't expected, a quiet relief. She wasn't sure if Officer Daniels had truly forgiven her or if she was just being polite, but at least the conversation hadn't ended in hostility. That had been Margaret's biggest fear. She had spent so many years priding herself on being a good person, yet one phone call had exposed something ugly in her. As she turned to leave, Officer Daniels spoke again. "You know, Mrs. Whitmore," she said, tilting her head slightly. "There's a saying in my family, the best apology is changed behavior." Margaret met her gaze and nodded. "I'd like to do better. I just don't always know where to start." Officer Daniels crossed her arms. "Then start with this, come sit with us. Eat with us. Get to know people outside of the ones you're used to." She gestured to the picnic table, where several parents, most of them Black or Latino, were laughing and chatting. Sometimes, real change happens over a plate of food. Margaret hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was more nervous about feeling out of place or about saying the wrong thing again. But she had promised herself she would do better. She took a deep breath and nodded. "All right. I'd love to join you." As she sat down, she was immediately greeted by warm smiles and welcoming voices. A woman named Angela handed her a plate of ribs, while another man, Luis, passed her some cornbread. The conversation flowed easily, talk of kids, work, and neighborhood events. At one point, Margaret found herself laughing at a joke Luis made about the chaotic PTA meetings. It felt normal. Comfortable. Then, at the other end of the table, a woman named Deja spoke up. "You know, I saw what happened at the park the other day," she said casually, looking at Margaret. "You really thought Kaya was lost?" The table went quiet for a moment. Margaret swallowed. I thought she was alone," she admitted, looking down at her plate. "I thought I was doing the right thing, looking out for a child who might need help." She paused, then forced herself to be honest. "But I also know I wouldn't have called if she looked like Ethan." Deja studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That's real. I appreciate you admitting that." Angela chimed in. "Yeah, we don't need people to be perfect, we just need them to be willing to see the problem." Margaret felt a lump in her throat. She had spent so much time trying to prove, to herself, to others, that she wasn't the kind of person who would do something like that. But maybe the real work wasn't about proving anything. Maybe it was about listening, learning, and showing up. As the picnic went on, Margaret found herself talking with more parents, hearing their stories, times they had been judged unfairly, times their children had been treated differently in school. She realized how much she had never considered, never had to consider. By the time she and Ethan got up to leave, the sun was beginning to set. She turned to Officer Daniels and smiled. "Thank you for inviting me to sit with you today," she said. The officer nodded. "Keep sitting with us, Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the words. As she walked back to her car, Ethan skipping ahead, she felt lighter. She wasn't done learning, and she wasn't done making mistakes. But she was here, and she was trying. And that, she hoped, was a start. Over the next few weeks, Margaret found herself thinking about the Unity picnic often. The warmth of the conversations, the kindness of the people she had met, it had left an impression on her. But more than that, it had left her with a sense of responsibility. She had spent so many years in her small bubble, surrounded by the same people, the same routines, the same way of thinking. It was easy to believe she understood the world when she had only been looking at a small part of it. She decided it was time to step outside that bubble. A chance to listen. The first step came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while picking up Ethan from school, she noticed Officer Daniels standing near the entrance, talking to a few parents. Margaret hesitated but then took a deep breath and walked over. "Hello, Officer Daniels," she said, offering a small smile. The officer turned and gave a nod. "Mrs. Whitmore. Good to see you." Margaret glanced at the group. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," said one of the parents, a woman named Carla. "We were actually just talking about a meeting at the community center next week. A discussion about inclusivity in our schools." Margaret blinked. "I didn't know there was a meeting." Carla shrugged. "It wasn't exactly advertised everywhere. But that's why we're trying to spread the word." Margaret hesitated. A few months ago, she wouldn't have considered attending something like this. It would have felt too political, too uncomfortable. But now? "I'd like to come," she said before she could second-guess herself. Officer Daniels gave her a knowing look. "Good," she said. "We need more people like you in the room." A hard conversation. That night, Margaret told Lisa about the meeting. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "You're going to a meeting about inclusivity?" "Yes," Margaret said, folding her hands. "I think it's important." Lisa studied her for a moment. "Mom, can I ask you something? Why did you call the police on Kaya that day?" Margaret's stomach tightened. She had been hoping to avoid this conversation, but she knew she couldn't. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood," she admitted. "But I see now that I wasn't. I was making an assumption. A wrong one." Lisa sighed. "You know, when I was in high school, my friend Jasmine came over once, and you kept asking her where she lived, who her parents were, how she got here. You never asked those questions to my other friends." Margaret's heart sank. "Lisa, I don't even remember that." "I do," Lisa said softly. "And Jasmine did too. She never came over again." Margaret felt ashamed. How many times had she done something like this without even realizing? "I'm trying to change," she said quietly. Lisa nodded slowly. "I know. And I'm glad. But just know, it takes more than going to a meeting. It takes real effort, every day." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I'm ready for that." The meeting. The community center was packed. Parents, teachers, even a few students had come. Margaret found a seat near the back, feeling a little out of place but determined to listen. People shared stories about children being treated differently in school, about teachers having lower expectations for certain kids, about the subtle ways bias shaped lives. At one point, a woman stood up. "My son came home last week and told me another student's mother called the police on his friend for playing at the park alone." Margaret's breath caught. The woman shook her head. "How do we fix this if people don't even realize they're doing it?" Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. She wanted to stand up. To say I was that mother. To say I didn't know, but I'm learning. But she wasn't ready yet. For now, she just listened. A small but important step. A week later, Margaret was back at the park with Ethan. She saw Kaya on the swings, her curls bouncing as she kicked her legs. Margaret walked over to where Officer Daniels was sitting on a bench. "Mind if I join you?" The officer looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Margaret sat down and took a deep breath. "I went to that meeting," she said. "And I've been thinking a lot about what Lisa told me. About things I've done before, things I didn't even realize were wrong." Officer Daniels was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "That's how it starts," she said. "Realizing it's not just about one mistake. It's about unlearning years of habits." Margaret swallowed. "I don't want to be the kind of person who sees a little girl at a playground and assumes she doesn't belong. I want to do better." Officer Daniels looked at her and, for the first time, truly smiled. "Then keep showing up, Margaret," she said. Margaret nodded, watching as Ethan ran over to Kaya, laughing. She still had a lot to learn. But for the first time, she knew she was on the right path. In the following weeks, Margaret continued making small but meaningful changes. She attended more community meetings, read books about racial bias, and had uncomfortable but necessary conversations with friends and family. But the real test came when the annual Greenfield Neighborhood Watch meeting rolled around. For years, Margaret had attended these meetings religiously. They were usually filled with discussions about property values, minor complaints about noisy teenagers, and the occasional debate over whether or not to install more security cameras. This time, Margaret walked in with a new perspective. She spotted a familiar face, Carla, the woman from the school pickup line, sitting near the front. Normally, the meeting was overwhelmingly white, but today, there were more Black and Latino residents in attendance. It wasn't a coincidence. As the meeting began, the usual concerns were raised: parking issues, speeding on residential streets, the importance of keeping the neighborhood safe. Then, a man named Richard, who had been on the neighborhood board for years, spoke up. "We've had a few reports of unfamiliar individuals walking through the neighborhood at odd hours," he said, adjusting his glasses. "We want to remind everyone to stay vigilant. If you see someone who looks suspicious, don't hesitate to call the authorities." Margaret's stomach clenched. She had sat through the same conversation before without thinking twice. This time, she raised her hand. Richard, surprised, gestured for her to speak. Margaret cleared her throat. "I think we need to be careful about what we mean by suspicious," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Are we talking about actual crimes? Or just people who don't look like they belong?" A murmur spread through the room. Richard frowned. "Well, of course, we don't want to profile anyone." "But we do," Margaret interrupted gently. "Without realizing it. I know because I did it myself." Carla turned to look at her, curiosity in her eyes. Margaret took a deep breath. "A few weeks ago, I called the police on a little Black girl at the park because I assumed she was alone. She wasn't. Her mother is actually a police officer. And I was wrong." The room was silent. Margaret continued, "I thought I was just being cautious. But in reality, I was making an assumption based on race, not behavior. And I think we all need to ask ourselves, how often do we do the same thing without realizing it?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I'm sure your intentions were good, Margaret, but intentions don't erase the impact," Carla interjected, her voice calm but firm. "What Margaret is saying is important. We all want to keep the neighborhood safe. But safe for who? If we're only calling the police on people of color while ignoring the white teenagers vandalizing the bus stop, then we're not protecting the neighborhood, we're just reinforcing biases." A few people nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable. Richard sighed. "So, what are you suggesting?" Margaret glanced at Carla, then back at the room. Maybe instead of jumping to call the police, we should get to know our neighbors better. Maybe we should have more community events, more chances to meet the people we're so quick to label as outsiders. Carla smiled. And maybe the neighborhood watch shouldn't just be about reporting people. Maybe it should be about actually looking out for each other. The conversation continued, and for the first time in years, the meeting wasn't just about property values and security cameras. It was about change. A new kind of neighborhood. The next Saturday, Margaret was back at Greenfield Park. But this time, she wasn't just watching from the sidelines, she was organizing an event. A neighborhood meet and greet. There was food, music, games for the kids. And most importantly, people talking, really talking. Margaret watched as Ethan and Kaya ran across the playground together, their laughter ringing out. Officer Daniels approached her with a cup of lemonade in hand. "You know," she said, "I never expected you to be the one leading this kind of change." Margaret chuckled. "Neither did I. But you did the work," the officer continued. "And that matters." Margaret looked around at the diverse crowd, neighbors who might have never spoken to each other before, now laughing and sharing food. She had made a mistake. But instead of letting it define her, she had used it to grow. And maybe, just maybe, the neighborhood was growing with her. Months passed, and Margaret's life had subtly but profoundly changed. The neighborhood meet and greet had been a success, leading to more gatherings, barbecues, book clubs, and even a mentorship program at the local school. The once tense community meetings had become more inclusive, shifting focus from suspicion to connection. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged each other before were now greeting one another by name, stopping to chat at the grocery store, and exchanging smiles instead of wary glances. One afternoon, Margaret found herself back at Greenfield Park, sitting on her usual bench. She watched as Ethan and Kaya ran across the grass, their laughter blending with the sounds of the playground. Officer Daniels approached, as she often did these days, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Margaret and sat down beside her. "You've been busy," the officer said with a small smile. Margaret chuckled, shaking her head. "I never thought I'd be the one organizing community events." Daniels took a sip of her coffee. "People always think change has to come from someone else. But real change starts with the people willing to look in the mirror." Margaret nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "I used to think being a good person meant just having good intentions. But I've learned that being a good person means constantly learning, listening, and making things right when you get them wrong." Daniels glanced toward the playground, where Kaya was showing Ethan how to do a cartwheel. "You know," she said, "Kaya still remembers that day at the park. But now, when she talks about you, she calls you Miss Margaret." Margaret felt a lump in her throat. "That means she sees you as part of her world now," Daniels continued. "And that's progress." Margaret looked out at the park, the same park where she had once made a terrible mistake. But now, it was different. Or maybe she was. She wasn't perfect, and she never would be. But she was here. She was trying. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she truly belonged.